The fight for security in Somalia's capital. Attacks in Mogadishu killed dozens. A stark reminder of the challenges still facing the UN-backed government after 20 years of civil conflict. The government battling armed groups and trying to pull its own soldiers into line. This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Hazem Sika. A fragile peace in Somalia has again been shattered in the most serious attack on Mogadishu since Al-Shabab fighters were forced out of the capital in 2011. Suicide commandos forced their way into the Supreme Court complex, spraying gunfire and detonating explosives. It's another setback for a country making small political gains, but struggling to establish a credible army and security forces. Critics argue the army is clan-based, made up of various militias and loyal to different warlords. They're paid relatively little, with wages coming from the European Union and the United Nations. And most serious of all, they're seen as lacking discipline and aren't trusted. A Human Rights Watch report in March accused militias and security forces of serious abuses, including rape, beatings and ethnic discrimination, and restricting access to food and shelter. We're going to start by talking to Augustine Mahiga. He's the United Nations Special Representative for Somalia, and he joins me on the phone now from Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. Thanks for being with us. Now, first of all, there are those like yourself, of course, who will argue the progress has been made in Somalia since the formation of this government in Mogadishu last year. But doesn't this attack by Al-Shabab fighters in the heart of the capital at an important government institution remind us that there's still a long way to go in restoring security?
This latest attack by the Al-Shabab in Mogadishu is the latest of what has always been expected as terrorist counteroffensive against the successes of the Somali forces and the African Union force. Previous attempts in the past few months have been foiled and preempted in time. But this one was well coordinated and very tragic indeed. But it does not significantly reverse the successes both in political progress as well as in the security sector development and the performance of AMISOM and the Somali forces.
But doesn't
they resort to tactics of terror?
But doesn't the scale and the audacity of this attack, less than a year after a new president was elected with a mandate to improve security, that's got to be something that concerns you? Definitely,
it's a matter of great concern. And this is going to be one of the major issues to be discussed at the international level. In the forthcoming conference in London on the 7th of May, security sector development and the improvement of the Somali forces needs to be addressed urgently. And this was also behind the Security Council decision to ease the arms embargo to the Somali forces.
I want to ask you as well about the criticism that's been made of the Somalian army that we just mentioned at the top there, that's saying that it is still essentially clan-based, made up of a number of different militias who are loyal to different warlords, that they're paid relatively little. There is this Human Rights Watch report as well in March that accuses these militias and security forces of some serious abuses, rape and beatings and ethnic beatings among them. I mean, all of that questions the credibility of this plan that has been put into place to restore security in Somalia, doesn't it?
The security army has been built from scratch. It was being trained and sent right away to the front line for fighting. It hasn't yet established its own full command and control. Indeed, it was built from militia and warlords, but the influence of warlords has significantly been eroded, and the Somali army efforts is taking place. There are improvements in various brigades that have just been mentored by the African forces on the ground, and the kind of training that has been provided by the European Union, for example, is very professional by some of the finest armies in the world. Discipline needs to be instilled, as you would expect. Militias that have been loyal to warlords that have no political significance now will take time to be integrated into the national army. But it is a major development that will take time. To build an army is a long haul and a long-term commitment.
I want to ask you as well about a criticism that's been made of all of this in the past, which I'm sure you've heard, and that is that the biggest problem with Somalia, some people say, is foreign meddling. And would the country be better off if Somalis were simply left to solve all of these problems on their own without any sort of international involvement?
No, actually, Somalia has taken control and ownership of the political process. We facilitated whatever was being decided and carried forward by themselves. In this new government, after great effort to put a legitimate, representative and democratic government, the hallmark of this government is ownership and leadership by the Somalis themselves. They do admit, however, that they would need assistance, but assistance on their own terms and at their own timing. And this is where the difference comes. The Somalis would want to carry forward, and that's why they've been successful when the process was brought inside the country, and the decisions to bring external assistance has to be at their discretion and on their terms.
All right, Augustine Mahiga, Special Representative of the UN Secretary General for Somalia. Appreciate you talking to us on Inside Story. Well, let's bring in our other guest now. In Mogadishu, Abdurahman Hosh Jibril, a Somali Member of Parliament and former Minister of Constitutional Affairs and Reconciliation. And from Nairobi, Laetitia Bader, a researcher with Human Rights Watch. And also in Mogadishu, Abdi Aynte, Director of the Heritage Institute for Policy Studies. Thank you for being with us, Abdurahman Hosh Jibril. If I could start with you, and I want to ask you pretty much the same question that I put to Augustine Mahiga there, and that is this attack on an important government institution in the heart of Somalia has got to remind everyone involved that your government still has a long way to go in restoring security in the country.
The incident that happened yesterday was very tragic. We lost a lot of good people, some prominent lawyers who took part in the transformation of this country. One of them was a member of the Independent Federal Constitution Commission that basically drafted the new constitution that we are based on. And the other was a human rights lawyer who just defended a journalist successfully, and other judges. So that's very tragic, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the government doesn't have any capacity to defeat Al-Shabab. Al-Shabab, as you can say now, is a criminal outfit. It's no longer a fighting machine. And I agree with you that the government doesn't have much capacity, but like any other country that comes out of a post-conflict position, and also whose army was drafted from ragtag armies of militias, I think they're doing a very good job. The security for the past few weeks was very tight in Mogadishu. I was traveling around in the city late at night, and there were checkpoints. This lapse happened, and I think it's something that will be a teaching moment that we can learn from. But I think considering everything, I think the Somali armed forces and the security sector are doing the best they can with the help of AMISOM. And I think the training that they're getting now on command and discipline, I think that will help. But overall, I think they're doing a good job.
Laetitia Bader, obviously tied in with all of this are these human rights abuse allegations, which I know your group has been involved in documenting. Just talk us through some of that and this report that your group has recently published, and the abuses in the country that you say have been taking place on a large scale.
Yes, I think in many ways yesterday's tragic incidents highlight the need for the government to be given the space and to be also given the time to focus on building a competent and accountable police force within the capital. The attack at the very heart of the capital showed that ensuring security inside of Mogadishu is a priority, and so ensuring security not only for government institutions but also security and protection for amongst the most vulnerable population. And this is where our recent report really highlights one of the groups which are particularly vulnerable in Mogadishu, and these are the displaced population, many of whom arrived in Mogadishu during the famine in 2011 and since as a result of insecurity in the areas of south-central Somalia where they come from. And they basically arrived seeking a safe haven in Mogadishu, and a lot of the time what they actually encountered was an incredibly hostile environment, and the very actors which many of them thought would actually be offering them protection. Now, these were either government forces or government-affiliated militia. Now, several of these militia were actually affiliated to local authorities and local district commissioners. In fact, these were the very actors who were abusing them. We documented a range of abuses, from sexual violence in several displaced camps and areas from 2011 through to the end of 2012, but also restrictions on assistance, looting of food aid, the use of shelter and tents which were given to the displaced to basically control their movement and through them obviously to have access to greater assistance. And then also this whole issue of discrimination against this particularly vulnerable population who come from the regions of Bay and Bakul, who are not part of the more prominent clans and groups inside of Mogadishu and who are particularly vulnerable. And this is where we are saying that the government needs to be focusing, and actors involved in the security services need to be focusing in giving the government the time to basically develop a competent police force in Mogadishu.
All right, let's put that some of that back then to Abdurahman Hosh Jibril in Mogadishu. You heard earlier the allegations that Laetitia Bader made there about human rights abuses in the country. Obviously, this is, if these allegations are to be believed, this is something that is a great cause for concern about the direction that Somalia is going in.
I certainly believe that there are some abuses going on, and part of the solution lies in teaching the forces, the security forces, about human rights. Just last week, on 1st of April to 5th April, the government, in partnership with civil society and parliament, we had a 5-day conference or a national dialogue on judicial reform. And some of the recommendations that came out of that is to incorporate human rights education in the curriculum of the training of the police, the army, the prisoners' guards, and hopefully that can be implemented. On the other hand, I'm a member of the Parliamentary Committee on Human Rights and Humanitarian Affairs, and one of the things that we're thinking about is translating the International Convention on IDPs, or it's called the Kampala process or the Kampala Convention, into a domestic legislation. I mean, that international legal instrument was signed by the Somali government in May 2011, but it hasn't been turned into a domestic legislation. So we want to do that so that when dealing with IDPs, we can follow international standards on human rights. Right now, the government's thinking of moving the IDPs to a better place, but we want to make sure, and our committee wants to make sure that the methodology or the model that they use would be consistent with international human rights and also consistent with the fundamental rights contained in the Constitution.
Now, what is your current assessment of the situation in Mogadishu, particularly in this all-important area of security?
Well, I think the events of yesterday, I think, highlight that even though the security situation in Mogadishu has improved quite considerably in the last year or so, I think what it highlights is that it is quite fragile, that it is reversible, and that security apparatuses in Somalia remain to be very weak and in some cases even very much disorganized. It was particularly, I think, interesting that these attacks took place under the backdrop of the fact that the intelligence agencies in Somalia at least knew at least the method of the attack, that it was going to be a storming of important installations. They knew about this at least 2 months ahead of time, and they've been telling other people to be vigilant about it. So the fact that they knew about it and did nothing to prevent it, I think highlights that there needs to be a lot of work still done on the security apparatuses, especially, you've got the intelligence service, the police, and the military. I think I think it's not secret in Somalia that security institutions in general are quite weak and underfunded, and their training and equipment is not up to the standard. So I think what it highlights, what happened on Sunday, is that a lot of work needs to be done on that area.
Well, let's just remind ourselves of how we got here and just refresh everyone's memories a little bit. Al-Shabab, which means the youth, is an armed group fighting for an Islamic state in Somalia. At one stage, it controlled large parts of the country, but a sustained military campaign by the African Union has forced the group to give up a lot of its territory. In August 2011, fighters were driven from the capital, Mogadishu. Months later, they responded, attacking buildings housing the transitional government, killing 82 people. 2012 saw the group flushed out of more towns, eventually losing their last urban stronghold of Kismayu in October that year. It's forced fighters to revert to guerrilla tactics with a series of suicide and bomb attacks carried out in the capital this year, culminating in Sunday's assault. Laetitia Bader, what do groups like Al-Shabab represent to you? Are they a symptom of a wider problem in Somalia?
I mean, Al-Shabab are definitely working within a context of complete impunity, which has been around and has basically been one of the main causes of the conflict. I mean, they are, basically the result of decisions by the international community and regional groups at the time. They are also, once again, in part a result of the failings of previous transitional government to really gain and to be able to basically offer basic protection and services to the population. And this is, one of the main concerns at the moment. The current government is under enormous amounts of pressure to basically move outside of Mogadishu into stabilization areas, etc., when if they are not able to provide basic protection and services even to their population in Mogadishu, there is a risk that groups, whether it's Shabab or others, could once again gain support. And this is where, once again, we are calling on the authorities, but also the international community, and particularly governments which are interested in security sector reform, to also prioritize the creation of an accountable both army but also police force. And key to this is to start looking at how to vet both individuals within the security services, but also individuals within the police force, but any new recruits.
Abdurahman Hosh Jibril, I mean, when you look at Al-Shabab, I mean, they've been variously dismissed as a terrorist group, and you called them criminals earlier. But we've seen clearly with this attack that they cannot be ignored at this point. Isn't it inevitable that there will have to be some sort of political solution that involves them?
Well, I think from way back 2009 to the time when I was a minister last year, up to this government on the calls made by the president and the prime minister, I think there's always been an olive branch out there for them to join the political process and denounce violence, especially those youngsters who have been brainwashed to join this outfit. So I don't see any problem with that. But as Laetitia was saying, I think if the international community does not respond to the call of the government to provide direct assistance so that it can provide services to the public who live in newly liberated areas. I think there is the chance that the public may say, you know what, if we're not getting any services and not getting, and by services, I mean economic development, schools, police, judiciary. If they don't get that, then I think we are in a position that Al-Shabab or other criminal elements may fill that vacuum. Together with that, I think the judicial system must be improved quickly. We had those recommendations out there, but they are only recommendations on paper.
Let's talk a little bit more then about what gives people a cause for optimism when they look at Somalia. The man charged with improving Somalia's lot is President Hassan Sheikh Mohamud. He took office in September, an academic and civic activist with little political experience and the first elected president since 1967. And he is enjoying some success. The United States formally recognized the African nation's new government in January, the first time it's done that since 1991. In March, the UN Security Council voted unanimously to partially suspend an arms embargo for 12 months. And on Friday, the International Monetary Fund announced it was recognizing Somalia's government after a more than 20-year break in relations. So, Laetitia Bader, some cause for some signs of progress there, some cause for optimism?
Yes, definitely. And in particular, given that the government has set some key issues as their priorities. The President himself has mentioned issues around accountability of government forces in numerous speeches, has said that this is a priority, has also said that judicial reform is a priority. So, I mean, we are definitely very happy to see these public commitments. Not what we would like to see more of now is this converted into concrete action. Around judicial reform, I mean, yesterday's events highlighted once again that one of the key areas of judicial reform will also be making sure that the judicial profession, that lawyers, that judges are also protected, given the often very difficult nature of their work. But also on the whole issue of security sector reform, once again, it's not just about increasing the size of the army, it's not just about increasing where a Somali army would be present, it's also fundamentally about changing the nature of the army and making sure that this is an accountable force, both the army but also the police force, and a police force that basically civilians would also feel that they can go to and turn to for redress. Time and again in our research we have had individuals who are victim of abuses who have told us they don't trust the police, they don't trust the government forces, and this really needs to change, and this is where we need concrete action, both from the government but also by the donors who will be discussing a lot of these issues at the London conference.
Abdi, if I could turn back to you on this. I mean, we mentioned a little bit earlier there some of the signs of progress in Somalia. Are you ultimately hopeful that things will get better in the long term?
Well, I think we are now on a trajectory that things are generally improving compared to just a few years ago, and I think there are plenty of reasons to be very optimistic about the situation in Somalia today. I think we have a permanent government. We have a very strong African Union peacekeeping mission that has been doing its job for the most part in Somalia. I think the government and its institutions in general and its leaders are generally considered to be comparatively a lot more legitimate and credible than the previous ones. And so taking all of this together and taking a concerted and international effort, I think one can be optimistic about the situation in Somalia. Having said that, I think we cannot underestimate the challenges that Somalia continues to face. Number one, you still have an exceptionally chronic, weak institutions that are simply either unable to deliver service or are non-existent. You have corruption that is still very much a reality in Somalia. So we have a lot of challenges that are still facing this country, but I think we can be optimistic about it.
All right, and on that note, we'll have to leave it. Thank you to all three of our guests, Abdurahman Hosh Jibril, Laetitia Bader, and Abdi Aynte. And thanks also to Augustine Mahiga, who joined us earlier on the phone. That's it for this edition of Inside Story. Thank you for joining us. Don't forget, you can find this program and many more at aljazeera.com. Just follow the links for programs and Inside Story, and of course you can leave us your comments there too. I'm Hazem Sika. Bye for now.